See if this echo can be overcome by speaking slow, as I was just advised. But that's very hard for me. There is, of course, no state of American poetry, but states, moods, agitations, dissipations, renunciations, depressions, acquiescences, elations, angers, ecstasies, just as no music to our verse, but vastly incompatible musics, no single sentiment, but clashes of sentience, the magnificent cacophony of different bodies making different sounds, as different as the hum of Hester Street from the gush of Grand Coulee, the buzz of Central Park on August afternoons, from the shrieks of oil-coated birds in Prince William Sound. The state of American poetry in 1990 can be characterized by the sharp ideological disagreements that lacerate our communal field of action, making it volatile, dynamic, engaging. What I hear then in the state of the art of poetry in 1990 is an implicit refusal of unity that is the result of our prodigious and magnanimous outpouring of words. In saying this, I register my own particular passion for poetry that insists on running its own course, finding its own measures, charting worlds otherwise hidden or denied, or perhaps best of all, never before existing. Poetry is aversion to conformity in the pursuit of new forms, or can be. By form, I mean ways of putting things together or stripping them apart. I mean ways of accounting for what weighs upon any one of us, or that poetry tosses up into an imaginary air, like so many swans flying out of a magician's depthless black hat, so that suddenly, like when the sky all at once turns white or purple or day glow blue, we breathe all the more deeply. By form, I mean how any one of us interprets what's swirling so often incomprehensibly about us, or the stutter with which he stutter, the warbling tone in which she sing off and on key. If form averts conformity, then it swings wide of this culture's insatiable desire for, yet self-hatred of, assimilation, a manic depressive cycle of go along, go away, that is a crucial catalyst in the stultifyingly effective process of cultural self-regulation and self-censorship. When poetry averts conformity, it enters into the contemporary, speaking to the pressures and conflicts of the moment with the means just then at hand. By which I mean I care most about poetry that disrupts business as usual, including literary business. I care most for poetry as dissent, including formal dissent. Poetry that makes sounds possible to be heard, but never otherwise articulated. It's particularly amusing that those who protest loudest about the fraudulence or aridness or sameness of contemporary poetry that insists on being contemporary, dissident, different, and who profess, in contrast, the primacy of the individual voice, fanned by a genteel inspiration, produce works largely indistinguishable from dozens of their peers, and moreover, tend to recognize the value only of poetry that fits into the narrow horizon of their particular style and subject matter, as if poetry were a craft that there is a right way or a wrong way to do, in which case I prefer the wrong way. Anything better than the well-wrought epiphany of predictable measure, for at least the cracks and flaws and awkwardness show signs of life. Ideology, as in a particular and restricted point of view, way of hearing, tendency of preferences and distastes, everywhere informs poetry and imparts to it at its most resonant a density of materialized social being expressed through the music of a work as well as its multifoliate references. To pretend to be nonpartisan, above the fray, sorting the best from the weak without ideological grudges, as a highly partisan poet recently put it, as if to mark his own partisanship in the course of denying it, is an all too common form of mystification and bad faith aimed at bolstering the authority of one's pronouncements. As with George Bush's attempt to discredit special interests, that is, all us others, in the end we find the center is a little wizard with an elaborate sound and light show, good table manners, and preferred media access. What interests me is a poetry that does not edit out so much as edit in, that includes multiple conflicting perspectives and types of language and styles in the same poetic work. A poetry that would itself express the states of American poetry in 1990. Poetry should be at least as interesting and a whole lot more unexpected than television. But reality keeps creating trouble for poetry, for it constantly changes the terms of what's possible versus wildly improbable or surreal. And poetry that runs the risk of being too cautious will find itself well outstripped by events, even. I'm thinking for the moment of the McDonald's ad from Moscow, broadcast on the Academy Awards show last month. This was not a farcical pastiche of conceptual art fronting a social commentary, but rather what we were led to believe are real Russians enjoying the communion of international packaging, just like Dave and Betty and the kids do in Siyaset. Our images of each other and of other cultures seem to go from ignorance to sinisterly diluted fabrication, almost without any middle ground. Poetry can, even if it often doesn't, throw a wedge into this engineered process of social derealization. Find a middle ground of care in particulars, in the truth of details and their constellations. Provide a site for the construction of social and imaginative facts and configurations avoided or overlooked elsewhere. But to achieve this end, poets would have to be as alert to the presence of their culture as the designers of TV ads, which means a willingness to engage in guerrilla warfare with the official images of the world that are being shoved down our throats like so many tablespoons of Pepto-Bismol, short respite from the gas and the diarrhea that are the surest signs that harsh and uncontainable reality hasn't vanished, but has only been removed from public discussion. That means we can't rely only on the tools and forms of the past, even the recent past, but must needs invent new tools and forms that begin to meet the challenges of the ever-changing present. Innovation is a response to changing conditions, which is not to say that the work progresses as in a technological model, or say, today we make a better car than we had done years ago. It's never a question of better. The details, the particulars, and how they are ordered keep changing, and poetry is a way of articulating that. At a panel at Penn last month on a related theme to tonight's topic, our discussion again and again pummeled into the problem of balkanization or fragmentation. How to evaluate the fact that in the last 20 years, a number of self-subsistent poetry communities have emerged that have different readers and different writers and different publishers and different reading series, even increasingly separate hierarchies and new canons with their own awards, prizes, heroines. One response to this new proliferation of audiences is to lament the lack of a common readership. I'm not talking about those who want to resurrect a single canon of Western literary values. The ethnocentrism and ideological blindness of this position has been well established enough not to bear repeating at St. Mark's this Friday night. What I take more seriously are the pluralist ideas supporting an idealized multiculturalism, the image of poets from different communities reading each other's works and working to keep aware of developments in every part of the poetic spectrum. The idea of diversity, as it is advertised in almost all the new college publicity, is the most superficial indication of this tendency. More significant is the introduction of multicultural curricula in the high schools and colleges. My problem is not the introduction of radical alternatives to parochial and racist reading habits engendered by the educational system and the media, but that these alternatives are often ameliorative rather than politically or aesthetically exploratory. I see too great a continuum from diversity back to new critical and liberal democratic concepts of a common readership that often, certainly not always, have the effect of transforming unresolved ideological divisions and antagonisms into package tours of the local color of gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, region, nation, class, even historical period, where each group or community or period is expected to come up with or have appointed for them representative figures who we can all know about. This process, more than not, presupposes a common standard of aesthetic judgment or implicitly aims to erect a new common standard. In this context, diversity can be a way of restoring a highly idealized conception of a unified American culture that effectively quiets dissent. For the twin ideas, or we should say now, I suppose, the twin peaks of diversity and the common reader evade the challenge posed by heterodox art, the poetries at the peripheries, to the very idea of a common standard of aesthetic judgment or the value of a common readership. We have to get over, as in getting over a disease, the idea that we can all speak to one another in the universal voice of poetry. History still mars our words, and we will be transparent to one another only when history itself disappears. For as long as social relations are skewed, who speaks in poetry can never be a neutral matter. The cultural space of diversity is mocked by the fact that the entire Haitian population of New York has to shut down downtown to have its voice heard. It's torn to shreds when the tragic death of one white heterosexual teenage boy from AIDS is given a public acknowledgement equivalent to the tragic deaths of thousands of individual gay men. I sometimes wonder even whether men can understand the voice of the women we live next to and from whose bodies we have come, since I hear every day the male version of the universal voice of rationality trying to control, as if by ventriloquism, female bodies. Though as men we have to make it clear that these men do not speak for us, do not represent us, but mock what men could be, but too rarely are. I wonder sometimes what sense it makes to speak of the possibility of communication among all the peoples of America as long as there are homeless who most of us have learned to cast outside the human circle of care and acknowledgement, unless it be on the universal broadcasting network's rock star and child celebrity tribute to the dispossessed, the survivors of racial violence, and the victims of sexual assault. In a society with such spectacularly inequitable distributions of power, the very idea of public space has been befouled, not by the graffiti of the folk, but by the domination of the means of communication by those dispossessed of their connection with just such folk. What can be decried as parochial patterns of reading is in fact an essential strategy for survival. To have a deep immersion in a contemporaneity and history that are difficult to locate and need to be championed. The direction of poetic interest can better be directed outward, centrifugally, to the unknown and the peripheral, than towards a constant centripetal regrouping and reshoring through official verse culture's enormously elastic and sophisticated mechanism of tokenization that targets, splits off, and decontextualizes, essentializing the mode of difference and incorporating the product, but never the process, into its own cultural space. Too often the works selected to represent cultural diversity are those that accept the model of representation assumed by the dominant culture in the first place. I see Grandma on the hill next to the memories I can never recapture, is the baseline against which other versions play. I see my Yiddish mama on Hester Street, next to the pushcarts I can no longer pedal. Or, I see my grandmother on the hill, next to all the mothers whose lives can never be recaptured. Works that challenge these models of representation run the risk of becoming more inaudible than ever within mainstream culture. There is no reason to suppose that poets working in opposition to the dominant strains of American culture should have any intrinsic interest in the narrow spectrum of official verse culture. If their work rejects the values of most of this work, indeed finds these values part of a fabric of social constructions that maintains coercive economic and political hierarchies, then the idea that all sides should politely take an interest in aesthetic craftiness is absurd. On the one side, such interest is patronizing. On the other, self-negating. The insidious obsession with mass culture and popularity, here translated into the lingo of a unified culture of diversity, threatens to undermine the legitimacy of working on a small, less than mass, and, yes, less than popular scale. Within the emerging official cultural space of diversity, figures of difference are often selected because they narrate in a way that can be readily assimilated into the conventional forms of the dominant culture. Difference is confined to subject matter and thematic material, aka local color, excluding the formal innovations that challenge those dominant paradigms of representation. Indeed, the political and social meaning of sound, vernacular, non-traditional rhythms, that is, those things that make a text a poem, are often discounted as negligible in the fetishizing of narrative and theme, formal values being left for a misconceived avant-garde that has been involuntarily decultured, deracinated, ungendered, and therefore removed from those contexts that give them sense. To be sure, signature styles of cultural differences can be admitted into the official culture of diversity if they are essentialized. That is, if these styles can be made to symbolically represent the group being tokenized or assimilated. Artists within these groups who are willing to embrace neither the warp of mainstream literary style through which to percolate their own experience, nor the woof of an already inflected and so easily recognized style of cultural difference, will find themselves falling through the very wide gaps and tears in the fabric of American tolerance. Such artists pay the price for being less interested in representing than enacting. Franz Kafka once wrote, "What have I in common with the Jews? I don't know what I have in common with myself." This can itself be understood as a Jewish attitude, but only if Jewishness is taken as multiplicitous and expressed indirectly. When Nicole Brizard makes a litany of the various shifting meanings we can have for her, we Quebecois, you Canadians, we women, you men, we lesbians, you heterosexuals, we poets, you prose writers, she raises a problem similar to Kafka's. John Berger, writing last week of the spiritual regeneration of the new nationalisms of Central Europe and the Soviet Union, remarks, quote, "All nationalisms are at heart deeply concerned with names. Those who dismiss names as details have never been displaced. But the peoples on the peripheries are always being displaced. That is why they insist on their identity being recognized." But naming is never a singular act. What is once named may no longer exist when that name is repeated. It is not that I wish to dismiss names as details, but to recognize details as more important than names, as always already peripheralized as names become packages through which a commodity is born. For even individuals are multiple. Indeed, as Levinas remarks, the mind is a multiplicity of individuals. What represents a Jew, or a white Protestant American, or an African American, a male or a female? In poetry, it's less a matter of thematic content than the form and content understood as an interlocking figure, the one inaudible without the other, like the soul and the body completely interpenetrating and interdependent. Formal dynamics in a poem create content through the shapes, feelings, attitudes, and structures that compose the poem. Content is more an attitude toward the work or towards language or towards the material of the poem than some kind of subject that is in any way detachable from the handling of the materials. Content emerges from composition and cannot be detached from it. Or, to put it another way, what is detachable is expendable to the poetic. What poetry belabors is more important than what poetry says, for saying is not a game, and the names that we speak are no more our names than the words that enter our ears and flow through our veins, on loan from the past, interest due at the dawn of each day, though not to the collector who claims to represent us in the court of public discourse, but to the collector we become when we start to collect what belongs to us by right of our care in and for the world. When we get over this idea that we can all speak to each other, I think it will begin to be possible, as it always has been, to begin listening to one another, one at a time, and in the various clusters that present themselves, or that we find our way to make.